All right, I will hand it over to Maja.
Great. Thanks so much, Kayla, and lovely to see everybody. Really delightful to be here with you. It's a very cold and dark January evening here in The Hague. So very nice to see you in various parts of the world. So I shall just share my screen for my PowerPoint. Hopefully that will be the right one. Nope. There, I think that's it. Okay, yeah, I think that's the right one. Yeah, so I was in fact assigned this topic, the international adoption of a right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which with pleasure I agreed to give a presentation tonight on from my vantage point. Indeed, as Kayla said, as a practicing international treaty lawyer, I've also worked at several of the international criminal tribunals and have been doing this writing and work on more comprehensive global governance reform with Arthur and others. So I'll weave it into like a broader perspective too, how I think this right could play out or should play out for us. So just in terms of my talk, and I'll try to keep it as brief as possible so we have time for discussion. But I'll talk about, the context for the adoption of this right, declared as a new universal right, the sort of reactions to the adoption and its genesis background, and then the implications for the international system at the national level, and then connecting it to other human rights and broader governance issues, which I think, from my perspective, are really crucial. And then what might be next for all of us and key takeaways from this analysis. So the international adoption of a right to clean, healthy, and stable environment basically took place initially at the Human Rights Council at its 40th session in October 2021. This is the first formal recognition of the right at the global level. So the Human Rights Council is an elected body, geographic representative, various states, Costa Rica, the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland proposed the adoption of this right, and it was adopted, the promulgation of this right, with 43 votes in favor and none opposed, with a few countries listed there abstaining. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but really what does this mean legally speaking? This is a non-binding resolution, as resolutions of the Human Rights Council are considered. So it has, a soft law import, a normative import. It can serve as a basis for further developments, but it does not technically have binding legal effect. So the content of this resolution. The content is quite broad. It's not extremely specific, and experts have talked about how difficult it might be to codify really this right clearly in whatever legislation at the national level, international level. But the resolution really talks about how environmental degradation, climate change, and unsustainable development constitute some of the most pressing and serious threats to the ability of present and future generations to enjoy human rights, including the right to life. So this feeling of sort of existential import and threat even is really encapsulated in this resolution. And also it has this sort of nice two-part perspective that the exercise of human rights is vital for the protection of the environment, but also the protection of the environment is also critical to the enjoyment of all human rights. I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. Yeah, so in terms of the basic general content, it's sort of like a very, in a way, boilerplate kind of a statement about that states should, all the burden again is on states, should build capacity to protect the environment, cooperate with each other, again, a very standard sort of UN resolution, within the UN system, with civil society, business, national human rights institution, to implement the right. So again, the responsibility then goes to these diverse actors in this decentralized international system, building synergies to promote the right, linking it with gender equality, adopt policies for the enjoyment of the right, including with respect to biodiversity and ecosystems. So great mention clearly policies, biodiversity, ecosystems, and linking strongly to the SDGs. So this is just like a really basic synopsis of the right as articulated in the resolution, and then also as articulated by the UN General Assembly in July of this last year, as the Human Rights Council asked the General Assembly to consider also this matter. So again, there's very wide support for this right in the General Assembly. 161 nations were in favor, not against, and just 8 abstentions. And again, this is not considered legally binding, this resolution of the General Assembly. And the background to how this came to pass, as often happens in UN processes, there was a push by 1,300 civil society organizations, at least, indigenous peoples group, also business groups, children around the world, national human rights institutions, previous UN special rapporteurs on the environment. And it was considered by many to be really an outcome from the 1972 Stockholm Declaration, sort of like a maturation of a concept from 1972, first Global Environment Conference. So for many in the sort of existing environmental architecture and institutions, they really felt it was a breakthrough. For example, Inger Anderson of UNEP, she has very strong words, calling it a shield for individuals and communities, talking about the special import for children. Also the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, not saying so proactively that it is in fact a shield, but saying that the right must serve as a springboard for transformative economic, social, and environmental policies to protect people and nature. So kind of like this foundational principle in terms of a human rights entitlement, and again, emphasizing that the broader human rights body of rights and environmental protection are really interwoven. And at the same session of the Human Rights Council, there was a special rapporteur established or designated to monitor human rights in the context of the climate emergency. So again, I would say this is part of sort of the international community trying to respond to the existential threat of climate change. And some groups said, okay, this is signaling this new human rights-based response to climate change, which is interesting. We will see how things play out, but this is at least some of the reactions. So yes, so there were these very strong reactions saying this is transformative. This is really an incredible shift for the international community, but I'll share some thoughts about, well, what will the implications really be, and given our current governance architecture, how profound and transformative will this right turn out to be as promulgated at the moment at the international level, as we are indeed within this triple planetary threat of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. The UN Secretary General has really clearly called it this triple planetary threat. We know we're in a state of climate emergency. So it's very interesting to think about this right in this context. So again, a few more very high hopes in reaction to the adoption of this right. Just a few words, you can scan the slide. Powerful and effective response will be the outcome for transformative change. That was from a Costa Rican delegate who sponsored the resolution at the Human Rights UNGA and Human Rights Council. Secretary General said it was a landmark development. Again, Inger Anderson, a victory for people on the planet. saying full implementation of the right will empower action, consistent global regulatory environment for businesses. So again, a lot of really high hopes for this right, which from my perspective, there needs to be a lot more work done for it to have such transformative consequences. And just one note in terms of the backdrop from Stockholm 1972, this again was really 5 decades in the making. So this took a long time to get this soft law statement at the international level. But indeed, I do agree that it has been elevated in terms of a normative recognition to sort of a universal recognition of this right. However, again, it is not so clear, it is not so specific, it is difficult to codify. So in terms of how much it can be used for example, litigation, really specifically protecting rights of individuals remains to be seen. So what are the implications in a bit more detail that I see in the international system, or lack of implications? This is not a binding international treaty. These are sort of normative, non-binding soft law statements. But in any case, even if you have binding international human rights treaties, which could be another step to enshrine this environmental right in an international binding treaty, most international human rights treaties are not very enforceable at all, international human rights treaties that are. So there's a general, very serious deficit in enforcement and implementation of international human rights law. And in this respect, I would say that the promulgation of this new right, which is so pertinent and relevant to the challenges that we see before us, ecologically speaking, also beg again for a more comprehensive reform of the current UN human rights architecture. And I'll just refer to chapter 11 of the book that Arthur Augusto and I wrote on the human rights architecture and the next step for its reform, which it's quite easy to sort of chart out how the current architecture, human rights architecture, could be reformed. There's a lot of academic writing on this topic, but there aren't actors really advocating for such structural governance reform at the moment. And I'll just mention also, I think this is connected, I'll say a bit more about this later, to general international rule of law reform, which is absolutely vital to confront the climate and ecological emergencies on the planet, and our other issues such as, hard military security issues, as we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine and other situations. I mentioned in these 2 briefs that I wrote on international rule of law, the strengthening of the international human rights architecture and other justice institutions, which I think are very fundamental if we're going to actually manage our ecological challenges, among other international challenges. So that's the international level, very weak implementation and enforcement, almost none, although there are special rapporteurs who will be reviewing. There will be more sort of normative commentary and discussion at the international level, which will be excellent, and different international organizations will be taking up this new environmental right in various ways, which will be very positive, but not a lot of binding effect. However, many nations have already enshrined such a right in national law. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, about 80% of member states of the United Nations have enshrined some sort of right to a healthy, clean, sustainable environment. But again, in a comment from 2020, the Special Rapporteur has said, in the context of the global environmental crisis, accelerated diffusion and adoption of good practices to protect human rights is imperative. So again, this issue of how do we diffuse and adopt and develop actually good practices to actually implement and enforce such a human right, because there is such lax and inadequate enforcement of, environmental regulations in general, and then such environmental rights as these. They're very hard to litigate, even though there have been some recent successes in some European countries and other countries around the world. It's generally been on existing human rights legislation that is much more justiciable, much easier to enforce rather than clear environmental rights. Also, in regional instruments and treaties, there's also some glimmerings of this human right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment. But again, they're just often glimmerings or referral or, in terms of indirect sort of references to such a right. And in terms of enforceability, usually very, very weak. One exception to that might be the European Convention on Human Rights. It has, relatively good enforcement for a regional court. The Council of Europe has recommended the drafting of an additional protocol for this right within the European Union. So that's a work in progress. So again, at the regional level, there's normative or sort of this philosophical promulgation of the right, but in terms of the implementation, enforcement, still very weak. So I'll just mention very quickly two different studies we did for the Climate Governance Commission over the last couple of years on how to connect national governance in climate and environment to the international obligations and how to diffuse key policies, including key legal instruments or legal rights at the international level. How do we accelerate that process? We did a paper on climate policy councils, so science-based national policy councils, which inform governmental policy making, where this human right to clean, healthy, sustainable environment could be like a real anchor for such councils. Last we checked, there was about 40 countries around the world who had such science-informed climate policy councils. So that's promising in terms of diffusing really excellent, high-quality science advice to policymakers, and that could be easily connected with a human rights foundation to climate and environment issues and policies. We also did a paper on a blueprint for an international policy clearinghouse where states can work together, governments around the world can collaborate to innovate, to find the sharpest policies at the national level to implement such a human right, to also implement their climate obligations. Right now, states are often acting in silos, developing their national policy. And so there isn't the accelerated innovation and sharing really to have the best practices and knowledge sharing around the world to really scale up policies at the national level. So these are sort of perspectives from our current international governance system, which is very decentralized. And I'll just speed through these slides because we did this very interesting work with the Exponential Roadmap initiative on exponential tipping points of new solutions adopted across economies. For example, electric vehicles, you can tailor policies to actually implement different solutions and there will be cascade effects. So I just think this is interesting also in terms of tipping points in the international system, also in terms of quote unquote policies around a human right to a clean, healthy and safe and sustainable environment. There's sort of a cultural momentum that also can happen if there's an enthusiasm and an uptake of such a norm, even if it's not binding. That it can help with dynamic system transition for the next steps of global governance. So I also think that's an interesting way to think about this new right. And just a few comments about its interdependence with other human rights, which is very clearly mentioned in both the Human Rights Council statement and also the UN General Assembly, which is extremely common to interlink all the different various human rights and the accretion of the various human rights since the Universal Declaration in 1948. And I think one really interesting set of rights to think about in relation to this one is international economic rights and the right to development, which really have to be closely sort of calibrated and thought about. And that's why I think it was very important also that these resolutions talked about the SDGs. And this is, I have a quote here from the ILO talking about, you know, how the impact of climate change and environmental damage has on economic growth and employment. An estimate that 1.2 billion jobs rely on health and environment and well-functioning ecosystems. So this sort of economic and labor dimension also is very important in terms of tackling our ecological challenges, and on the theme of just transition, which is about equity too, and taking care of the most vulnerable, and ensuring that in tackling the climate crisis and ecological crises, we also address the human development issues in a much more profound way, in harmony with the SDGs, or an elaborated, more refined SDG kind of roadmap. And I'll just say something very quickly about anti-corruption, sort of global democratic potential mechanisms, and international rule of law generally, that I've already mentioned. So I'm working currently with Integrity Initiatives International on the design of a new international anti-corruption court, which has been put, and grand corruption, the corruption of high-level political officials, it's rampant around the world. Unfortunately, it's thought to cost the world maybe estimated between 3 and 4 billion even per year, which is more than global military spending. So you get a sense of the scale, which global military spending is about 1.9 trillion a year. So corruption is often linked to human rights abuses at a high level, international security threats, but also to environmental destruction and environmental crime. For example, a lot of the deforestation that is happening around the world is linked to corruption or illegal, illicit, and criminal extraction or deforestation. So this is also sort of just a note that if we take such a human right alone and we think, okay, this is going to solve our ecological problems, it's not. We have to think about the governance integrity of the whole, indeed, international system, because we're dealing with international challenges and international ecological crises. And just also to mention, you know, human rights, international rule of law are really core principles for democratic representative governance. And I just wanted to flag again the sort of adjacent issue of how can we democratize or build truly consultative, participatory governance into the system at the international level. And in our book, we talk about it, but there's also like very active campaigns to try to bring to life a UN Parliamentary Assembly modeled roughly on, you know, the EU Parliament as it got started and was strengthened over time. So I think this is also very important as again, you know, human rights, inclusion, protecting the vulnerable, being accountable is so also fundamental to this, right? And I'll just mention also very briefly the international rule of law reform. If the International Court of Justice was reformed to have individuals able to take cases, you know, for climate justice, to take nations to court, for example, on this right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, this would be a huge upgrade and innovation for the international system. The International Court of Justice has not been reformed for over 75 years, and it's here in The Hague, and at the moment it doesn't even have mandatory jurisdiction for UN members. It's sort of just been left neglected for over 7 decades. So there's many ways the international community could greatly strengthen international rule of law, and also pursue the promise of a sustainable international peace at the same time. For example, if this International Court of Justice was strengthened. And that's another chapter I just wrote in a book on the peaceful settlement of disputes and strengthening international rule of law for like the general peaceful environment we need in the world in order to tackle our ecological problems. So just to finish, what next? I'll just tell you a bit about the Climate Governance Commission that I've been working on, which arose out of this New Shape Prize that Arthur and I and Augusto won on like a new comprehensive model to manage global catastrophic risk, one of which is climate change. We had our first strategy meeting in 2019 for this Climate Governance Commission, which is really meant to look at all of the layers of governance, but in particular international governance, to grapple with the climate crisis and related ecological risks. We've just moved into this new high-level phase of the commission, where Mary Robinson of the Elders is serving as chair, Johan Rockstrom is a co-chair, and there's other experts and thinkers from all over the world who are contributing. And again, you all know the science of the risks we're running now and how sort of existential, again, fundamental this crossroads in human history is, as the UN Secretary General has mentioned. We're really at a make or break moment. And I think this is, acknowledged at parts in the substance of these resolutions of the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. But then how do we make such a right reality and quickly? We know that we've now transgressed 6 of the 9, identified planetary boundaries. And again, we also have to support social economic development at the same time as confronting the climate crisis. We have to have emissions by half every decade. And of course, we're not on this path, yet we have the solutions. This is from Exponential Roadmap Initiative across the various sectors. We know what to do to address the climate crisis. The UN and in the language with this human right, they're talking about the triple planetary crisis of pollution or climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Climate, of course, is very interwoven, interdependent with these other crises, prongs of the crisis. And of course, all of the planetary boundaries, climate being one of them, are very much interwoven with each other. So you have to really think about all of them at the same time. In fact, even though, of course, there are techniques, governance techniques, other techniques that we have to apply to the different areas. So anyways, this slide shows that we have the solutions and to address the climate crisis and to meet the Paris Agreement goals, but we have this solution action gap. There's a gap between the solutions there and the action being taken. We have this policy gap. The policies that we need aren't being diffused, including the implementation of this human right to a healthy and sustainable environment. And we identified also this global governance gap, which again, there are key weaknesses and deficits in our current international human rights architecture, and they could be quite meaningfully upgraded if there was good advocacy for such a change. And such, governance reform is still considered to be quite futuristic and like too ambitious for individual states to be thinking about at this point. But we have to start thinking about such larger upgrades because of the seriousness of the challenges. And part of the problem with the thinking currently is that we have this path dependencies on the UN 1945 Charter, which of course was drafted in 1945 at a time where these ecological crises were not on the horizon. And we've just become accustomed to working within this older charter, whereas it was supposed to be rethought within 10 years. We now know also that we have to really shift our planetary international paradigms to think about what we know now about the planetary science, which is changing and improving every day. And also a comment about, this is like a rights-based approach with this new right that has been adopted, whereas the Earth Charter, which was not an official governmental statement, but it took more of a responsibilities and community approach. So I'd like to also sort of bring that into the mix, that, I don't know how helpful, or it's not the whole, it's only one piece of the puzzle, it's not the whole picture. In my view, we really need a very, very strong statement of international stewardship. Friends and colleagues at the Common Home of Humanity are really very much working on this, trying to get in also a new legal paradigm to recognize climate and possibly the other planetary boundaries as common heritage of humanity. So a rights-based sort of approach only gets you so far if you don't also have the responsibilities and this sense of common home and stewardship that also has a legal framework to work within. I think it's already been 40 minutes, so I won't go into this, but this is just sort of thoughts on how realistic, kind of getting these bigger global governance reforms, including the international human rights architecture, might be. There are challenges in the international system, a lot of inertia, a lot of collective action problems, but those can be overcome, partially with citizen diplomacy, smart coalitions of civil society groups, as indeed happened with the adoption of these new human rights. There was a very strong push from international civil society. So these civil society coalitions can get a lot done if they put their minds to it and have a focused goal, like the Landmines Treaty, the International Criminal Court. So there is promise to really reform the international system if there can be the convening of these quote unquote smart coalitions and putting together a very strong civil society movements. This list of how to design a successful civil society movement is from Jody Williams, who won the Nobel Peace Prize a number of years ago for her work on the landmine ban treaty. And that's one initiative that we convened to sort of do this advocacy work in the international system. And finally, I'll just mention this global communications campaign for the Climate Governance Commission to try to get the public opinion formation needed, because of course now there's growing concern among publics around the world about ecological issues. So we really need to get even more high quality information out, but also a diffusion of the solutions and possible approaches that citizens can think about and advocate for around the world, which, yes, like a positive, more positive solutions focused campaign, also interweaving the governance aspects is very badly needed. So my key basic takeaways, so these are sort of soft law normative statements at the international level of this new right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment. This is important, this quote unquote norm entrepreneurship. It does have an effect. It might be a slower effect of winning, hearts and minds and changing the thinking of different policymakers at various levels. However, from experience, as we see also from Stockholm Conference in 1972 to the adoption of this new human right in 2021, it takes time, norm accretion, policy, and also policy diffusion around the world. Takes time, many decades even. So, but we don't have time. We know the nature of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, et cetera. So my questions, to you and things we're thinking about in the Climate Governance Commission is, how do we catalyze accelerated uptake, implementation, good practices, effective policies at the international level, really across nations, with some speed and energy? And that, of course, includes the legal policy and the law reform that needs to happen across, almost 200 nations to make sure this right is properly enshrined among other policies that are linked. And then, this broader issue of reforming the international rule of law, kind of architecture, the human rights system, the UN Charter, which many experts have said, must and should, clearly enshrine in its next incarnation the notion of planetary, stewardship and health, or however, sustainability, however you want to articulate it. This is absolutely crucial for the 21st century. So we know that this kind of bigger governance at the international level reform has to happen. So, when will this crossroads or this moment come? Is there any hope for the Summit of the Future in 2023, 2024 that the UN Secretary General has called for, or otherwise? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So I think I will end there and look forward to your questions and discussion.
Anyone can chime in. Feel free to raise your hand if we get a little backlog, but at a point like this, just jump in. Maja, is this the most kind of abstruse human right we have at the moment, or is there more?
Abstruse. Okay, that's kind of the eye of the beholder kind of question. No, there's quite a lot of interesting accretion, I think, of human rights. So no, I wouldn't say so. I think in terms of like merging or starting to build the powerful connections between the international human rights field and the ecological protection, environmental international law fields, it's a great step forward. And I don't think it's abstruse, but I think, yeah, it is a watershed moment in terms of connecting those fields conceptually. And then, but yeah, again, very unfortunate that it took, 40 or 50 years to get there or to make those linkages.
Gary has a comment. Go ahead.
Okay, just a very short, because Maja knows about this a lot more than I do, but certainly, and she mentioned many things during the conversation that that I listened to well, and that's that, although we know a lot, perhaps, about what is taking place, we also know that the countries of the world are really not working together to formulate a better future. At least that's the way I see it. I'm just wondering if you see it the same way, Maja, or there's other ways of putting it. Because what we can see right now is that certain countries like China, like the United States, even the EU and other countries, are impacting climate issues and all kinds of population issues and everything else. Yes, and we know that, for example, Pakistan was flooded recently and had all these terrible problems. And they said, well, everybody else is talking about climate change. Nobody cares about Pakistan. So we just get flooded and die. So, the question for me is, are we going to first have to go through a lot of destruction and problems, and then the world will begin to reorient on a future where we're actually working together for a different kind of world, because the world that we're living in now will not be satisfactory, I think most of us know, in the future if we don't make the changes.
Yeah, I think from my vantage point, or what I'm seeing, I think the reality of the gravity of the situation still is sinking in to policymakers around the world of the climate and related ecological crises. So, the massive floods in Pakistan were a huge wake-up call, and I think it did get a lot of international policy attention, and people are paying some attention, but our general infrastructure to help each other is weak. Just generally, it's very weak. And I talk to people in the climate policy sphere, and they say, oh, everybody knows what the situation is in terms of climate change and other ecological issues, but that isn't my experience or impression with broader policymakers across the board, or even those in different ecological policy spheres. Many simply are not acting with the urgency required, which, Gary, to your point, really requires very deep, a new kind of level, deeper and much more refined and also inspired, yet urgent, international cooperation, like a new level of maturity, I think, will absolutely be needed on the international cooperation level to tackle these challenges. So I mean, to your question, like how much more chaos and calamity will we have to go through before this kind of new awareness? I do see this new awareness kind of gelling, like this international solidarity and new bolder proposals, like from Mia Motley in Barbados about, reforming the Bretton Woods institutions, or like really clearly kind of addressing some of the economic disparities and proposing bold sort of these macro solutions that we'll need. So some of those voices are starting to appear, but of course there are the very, very deeply entrenched economic issues and power bases in various countries, different elites that simply want to keep their power, and they're not interested in ecological crises or future generations. It's just about keeping their power, which is like it's an age-old human story. It's not unique to this era, right? But those forces are absolutely blocking forward motion. But I think there's also just this informational disconnection where many policymakers don't truly understand the planetary science, A, and B, also this global governance thinking and policy gap. People aren't thinking in general yet in terms of these macro global governance reforms, except like it has been promising, proposals like Mia Motley's, and then also, with this International Anti-Corruption Court, there are some larger governments that are now getting more and more interested in this, like a new international court, which is a macro reform. So you see that there is an appetite when you have a good proposal, a sound proposal, and you connect it with the policy challenges that are in front of us. So a lot more norm entrepreneurship needs to be done. But I don't know how many calamities we'll have to go through still, Gary. I don't know.
Who does?
Probably a lot. probably a few more, but
we need to pray a little bit.
yes.